ever wondered what happens when you put one of these over top of your septic system? Well, whenever you put a tree over top of a tank, a drain line, or any other part of a septic system, you always run the risk of roots. So let's go ahead and talk about what are some of the problems that can happen, what are the most common problems that happen, and how close is too close to your septic system. So let's go ahead and get into it. So let's talk a little bit about septic tanks, right? The tank is just a big concrete box. There's nothing special about them, nothing fancy. It's just a big rectangle, sometimes circular, depending on where you're at. But it's just a big rectangle to where when you flush the toilet, run the sink, bathtub, you name it, all that solid waste and liquid waste goes all the way to the tank. Heavy stuff falls to the bottom, lighter stuff floats up top, and then the liquid goes out and into the drain fields. Now, these boxes are supposed to be watertight, but it's only watertight for where the water's actually sitting. A modern septic system will usually have the seal at the top, so they'll build most of the tank and then they'll have the lid be put on top. Older systems would have the seal in the middle. Now, a tank is supposed to keep those solids in there so that way you can have clearer liquid going into the drain field so you can get a better lifespan out of the system. Doesn't always work out that way. Whenever you have the lid to the tank though, usually it'll be a standpipe or a manhole riser put on the front or middle or back of the tank depending on how it's designed. The lids don't always have access points though, right? What I mean by this is most of our tanks in our area have 3 lids. Sometimes you'll have 2 at minimum, 1 in the front, 1 in the back. But the most common setup you'll see is 3. You'll have a small one in the front, big one in the middle, small one in the back. And what'll happen is you'll usually see the standpipe on the front of the tank. And the reason why is so that way if you have something that clogs up the pipe or gets stuck in the front baffle, you have a way of pushing whatever that is out of the way. Now, let's just say that you don't have anything else on the other 2 lids. Well, there's nothing sealing those lids to the tank, so what can happen is if you put a tree, a bush, or any other kind of shenanigans on top of the system, you run the risk of those roots getting into the system. Now, trees always have roots. That's how they get their food. That's how they get their nutrients. Those roots work their way into the ground, and then what'll happen is they start to grow. And the more they grow, the further they get. I'm sure many of you guys watching this video have seen roots get into asphalt, concrete patios, concrete walkways. You've seen how much damage those roots can do. Well, if it's enough to destroy the road, guess what it's also enough to do? Destroy your tank. So most of these times, whenever I see somebody put a tree or a bush over top of a tank, like that red one, what can happen is you usually will find where the weakest seal is. Most of the time, that's gonna be the lid. Now, if you have roots coming into your septic through the lid, is it the end of the world? No, right? And the reason why is those roots usually just kind of dangle there. Now, if they go untouched and untreated for quite a while, then they can start to grow and they can become more of a problem. Usually how people will deal with it is physically remove the rooting device, such as a tree, a bush, or any other kind of shrubbery. Or you could use copper sulfate. Now, this is one of those things where you ask 10 different people their opinion on copper sulfate, you're gonna get 10 different answers. So I always recommend talk to your local contractor, see what their opinions are, see why they like it, see why they don't like it. I would argue it's easier and more cost-effective to just get rid of the tree and then physically remove the roots than it is to try and chemically remove the roots, because roots, they'll eventually come back. Everything that's a living thing at some point or other will regrow and it will start to cause problems again. So I'm not a huge fan of chemically treating the water. So I physically remove and then repair whatever's in there. There are other ways to deal with it too, mainly just trench around it. So like, for example, if you have a big tree like this, it could have roots 10 feet away from it, 15 feet away from it. And then you don't have to necessarily have it directly on the tank in order for the roots to be causing some problems. So if you cut a large trench through those roots, it can make it where those roots don't grow back, or at least they don't grow back very quickly. So beyond the lids of the septic system having root intrusion as a possibility, the other common location that you'll see roots is going to be around the seal for the inlet and outlet line. Now, what does that mean? The inlet line is going to be the pipe from the home to the tank, and the outlet line is going to be the pipe from the tank to the trenches. Now, usually in our area, the tank will have a larger hole that you slide the pipe into. Oftentimes it'll be a plastic grommet or some kind of hydraulic cement packed in there to seal up that pipe to the tank wall, so that way dirt and groundwater and all sorts of other stuff doesn't get into it. The problem is that hydraulic cement is flaky. As time goes on, roots will work their way into it and they'll pop it open and the roots can start to get into the tank. Now, if you have roots around the inlet or outlet line, the concern is the roots are going to work its way towards the sewage water. It's full of nutrients, nitrogen, all sorts of stuff that the plants like. So what'll happen is if you have roots dangling over the top of the sewer line, you can have it to where toilet paper gets stuck, feminine products get stuck, solids get stuck, and then you run the risk of it clogging and going back to the house. The outlet line, same concept, but it takes a little bit longer for that to happen. And the reason why, the baffle prevents most of the debris from getting out of the tank. So you have less solids that could potentially cause a clog. So unless the roots build up enough, you're not really going to notice on the backside. The front side is way more prevalent and still problematic. You can also have issues with those roots causing damage to the tank walls itself. So if, for example, you have the roots get in through the inlet seal and you do nothing about it, what can happen is those roots can get bigger. And the bigger and bigger those roots get, the more pressure you're putting on the pipe and on the tank walls itself. You don't normally see this as common, but it can happen. It just depends on what type of sealant they used around the inlet or the outlet line. Beyond the inlet and outlet line, remember, we talked there's two different styles of tank. You have your top seam and then you have your mid seam. Well, a lot of the time, that seal for the seams would be used with a mastic of some variety. And what can happen is those roots can work their way through the smallest of cracks, and then they can basically rip open the entire seal and start letting the tank itself leak. On a top seam tank, it's not as problematic. It's not good, but it's definitely not as problematic. Mid seam tank, that's where it can get really, really bad, because a lot of times those roots will get in there, but they're so small, and if you're living in the house, you're running enough water, you never actually notice those roots until you pump it. So let's just say that you pump the tank, the roots are starting to work their way in there, it maybe takes another 5 years before you pump it again. Well, now you gave it 5 years of undisturbed access to that septic water, and those roots are going to continue to grow and grow and grow. I've seen dozens, probably even close to hundreds of tanks by this point, where when you pump down the tank, you open it up, it is just a big mat of roots, and the tank walls are basically only being held up by the roots themselves. And the only way to get rid of it is to replace the tank. So if you have a mid-seam tank, it's a little bit more problematic and a little bit more dangerous to have trees sitting next to your system. So the stories that I was always told by arborists is as far as the canopy goes is as far as the roots will go underground. Same thing with the height, right? If the tree's super tall, obviously it's gonna have to have a really good anchor, otherwise it would fall, right? So if you have a giant tree like that guy right there, right next to your tank, you run a higher risk of those roots getting in through the mid-seam or top seam, depending on what type of tank you have. Lastly, it depends on the type of piping you have, because let's just say that you don't put a bush like that one over the septic tank, but you put the bush over top of your sewer line. Well, now you run the risk of those roots getting into the sewer itself. Same issue as with the tank, they're craving that water, right? They need it because it's got nutrients in it. Especially if you have a drought like we have where it's just not rained for a while. I mean, yesterday it rained, but for the last like 34 days, we had nothing. So if you have an old cast iron pipe, terracotta pipe, Orangeburg pipe, even PVC pipe, you run the risk of those roots working their way in there. Now, those 4 pipe types we've discussed in previous videos, but it really depends on how old the house is. So for example, Orangeburg pipe, you'll only ever really see that in homes from 1970 and older. Orangeburg pipe is this black tacky pipe material. Generally it would be some kind of like asbestos pitch mixture, and it's really brittle and fragile. And so what'll happen is if you put an excessive amount of weight or roots start working on it by hand, you can just flake that stuff right off. The roots will work their way in there. Terracotta pipe, now that is basically clay pipe. It's that orange pipe material that you usually see in like clay pots. Essentially, they'll have a bell shape and then they'll just slide them into one another. Oftentimes you wouldn't see any kind of sealant, but sometimes they would seal them. But most of the time they didn't. And because it was just a pipe shoved into the other pipe, you would see a lot more root intrusion as those roots just kind of worked their way in there, and there was no sealant to prevent them from doing that. Cast iron piping, that one's a little bit less likely to get roots. Usually if you have roots, that means you have another catastrophic failure somewhere else in the system. Most cast iron pipes would have, oakum and lead to join them together. Nowadays we don't use that. I'm sure there's some county or some state that uses cast iron still, but in Maryland, it's all Schedule 40 PVC. So cast iron pipe usually would have a crack or an issue with the sealant, and then that's where the roots would come in. PVC pipe, now when they glue those pipes together, basically what you're doing is you're melting the pipe to itself. And whenever you have root intrusion, it's usually because either somebody collapsed the pipe, hit the pipe, or did not glue it properly. Most common forms of root intrusion I see for sewer lines that are made of PVC is impact and ferncoes. A fernco is that black rubber gasket that you'd see for when you join two dissimilar sewer lines together. But the problem is some people weren't going to use the reinforced band. They would just use the black pipe or black fernco, and then that pipe would sag and it would create the space, and then the roots would work their way in that way. That's usually where I see roots on PVC. Now, with the roots in a sewer line, unless you're scoping the line, you don't really notice it until it's too late, right? I recently had a property with roots that looked like this one, and essentially what happened was they were using the bar sink, and for some reason it just never kept seeming to want to drain, until eventually they called us to take a look, and we're like, oh shoot, the whole thing's full of roots. Oh my gosh, like that's not good at all. Well, they had a giant tree sitting right over top the sewer line, so obviously that's where the roots were going to come in. Now, this particular house is from the 50s, so more than likely it's right at that transitionary point because the piping going to the house from the tank was PVC. The best advice I can give you, though, is don't plant anything near your septic system. It's not a good idea, even if it's a small bush like one of those, or it's a big tree like one of those. You run the risk of something getting in there and causing problems. It's not worth it. It's better to have an open field just like this, to where you don't have to worry about any of those roots getting in there and causing any backups for you. I know we covered a lot of ground. I am trying to add more visuals to these videos. If there's a certain area of conversation or a different way of doing this, leave a comment, let me know. I'm here to grow and learn with you and try to help you guys go through the world of well and septic. If you enjoyed this though, hit that like button, hit subscribe. I have more videos posted every day on the world of well and septic, and I look forward to talking to you guys tomorrow.